The arrival. Jack stood at his apartment door, staring at the screen. The notification blinked. Your new house assistant has arrived. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. It had been a long week, and he barely had the energy to deal with this. But living alone in a messy apartment was worse. He pressed the unlock button. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Standing outside was not a human. Jack knew that hiring alien workers was normal these days, but he hadn't expected someone like her. The creature before him stood tall, covered in smooth, dark green scales. She had sharp, golden eyes, a long tail that swayed slowly, and two small horns on her head. She wore a simple uniform, black with silver lines, neat and professional. Jack stared. The alien stared back. Then, in a calm and polite voice, she spoke. I am Zherna. I have been assigned as your house assistant. May I enter? Jack blinked. He had expected a robotic helper, maybe a humanoid eye. But no, he got a real, living alien maid. Yeah, sure, he muttered, stepping aside. Zherna walked in carefully, scanning the room like a security officer. Jack suddenly felt embarrassed about the mess. Clothes on the chair, dishes in the sink, a half-eaten pizza on the table. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. I will clean, she said simply. Jack scratched his head. Thanks. You, need anything? She shook her head. I have my own supplies. I only have one request. Jack frowned. Okay, what is it? Zherna looked directly into his eyes. Her golden gaze was intense, almost unsettling. Then she said, You must always wear your coverings in my presence. Jack paused. My, what? She gestured toward his clothes. Your coverings. Your garments. You must not remove them when I am here. Jack chuckled. What, you mean my shirt? Zherna didn't laugh. All of it. Do not be seen. Without it. Jack raised an eyebrow. Are you serious? She nodded. It is an important rule. Please follow it. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't planning to walk around naked, but this was a weird request. Maybe it was some cultural thing. He had heard that some alien species had strange traditions. All right. I'll keep my clothes on, he said. No problem. Zherna bowed her head slightly. Good. Now, I will begin cleaning. Jack sat on the couch, watching her move around the apartment. She worked fast, organizing, scrubbing, making everything shine. In less than an hour, the place looked better than it had in months. But something was odd. Every time Jack adjusted his shirt, Zherna would flinch slightly. If he reached to scratch his arm or roll up his sleeves, she would look away quickly, almost like she was afraid to see something. Jack decided to test it. He pretended to pull his collar down just a little. Zherna froze. Her tail stiffened, and her eyes widened for a split second before she whipped her head away, staring at the floor. Jack frowned. Zherna, why are you acting like that? She didn't answer. Instead, she spoke in a low, serious tone. You must not remove them, not even a little. A strange feeling crawled up Jack's spine. Why was she so scared? That night, Jack lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His apartment was completely clean now. Everything smelled fresh. Everything looked perfect. But Zherna's warning kept repeating in his head. You must not remove them, not even a little. Jack shook his head. It didn't make sense. Why would an alien maid care if he took his shirt off? It was such a small thing. Maybe her species had some religious rule about seeing humans uncovered. Maybe it was just an alien superstition. He sighed and turned off the lamp. Just as he was about to sleep, he heard something. A soft scratching noise. Jack's breath caught. His apartment was empty, except for Zherna, who had a separate room. So what was that sound? It came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jack sat up, listening. It was coming from his bedroom door. Slowly, he reached for the lamp, and turned it back on. The noise stopped. He waited. Nothing. Just silence. Jack swallowed hard. "Maybe I imagined it," he muttered. He turned the lamp off again. A second later. Bang! Something slammed against the door. Jack jumped out of bed, heart pounding. Then, silence again. He took a shaky breath and walked toward the door, hesitating before he grabbed the handle. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it open. Standing outside was Zerna. Her golden eyes were wide with fear. Her claws were digging into the wooden doorframe. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off with a sharp whisper. "You must never remove your coverings. Never." Jack felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Why?" he asked. Zerna took a slow step back. She looked terrified, like she had seen something she couldn't explain. Then she whispered, "Because something else is watching." Jack's blood ran cold. From inside his room, he heard soft breathing. But he wasn't alone. The forbidden sight. Jack stood frozen in the dim glow of his bedroom lamp, his breath caught in his throat. Zerna's golden eyes were locked onto him, wide with terror. Her dark green scales, which normally looked smooth and polished, now had a dull sheen, almost as if fear had drained their color. "You must never remove your coverings." Her voice was lower this time, almost pleading. Jack swallowed hard. His skin prickled with unease. From inside the room, he could still hear it. The breathing. Slow, shallow, uneven. But there was no one else in the room. Jack's fingers twitched at his side, ready to flick the light switch, ready to prove to himself that he was imagining things. But something in Zerna's face stopped him. She wasn't just afraid. She was horrified. "Zerna," Jack whispered, forcing his voice to stay calm. "What's going on?" She glanced over his shoulder, into the dim space behind him, and then back at him. She swallowed hard. "Step out. Slowly. Do not turn your back to the room." Jack hesitated. "You're serious?" Her sharp, clawed hand darted out and gripped his wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to send a clear message. "Do it now." Jack exhaled sharply and took a slow step backward. His pulse pounded in his ears as he kept his gaze locked on the doorway. He moved carefully, keeping his body turned slightly, not fully exposing his back to the darkness behind him. Zerna's claws trembled slightly as she pulled him further away. The hallway light was dim, but compared to the cold emptiness of his room, it felt like a spotlight of safety. Finally, Jack stepped over the threshold. Zerna moved instantly. She reached up to the door controls on the side panel and pressed something Jack had never used before. The lockdown sequence. His bedroom door slammed shut with a metallic hiss. A second later, red warning lights glowed around the edges of the frame. A quiet mechanical voice from the security system whispered, "Containment mode activated. Biological hazard detected." Jack's heart almost stopped. He whipped his head toward Zerna. "What the hell do you mean? Biological hazard? There's nothing in there." Zerna didn't respond. She kept staring at the door, her breathing shallow. Her tail flicked once, twice, like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Jack took a shaky breath, trying to keep his voice level. "Tell me what's going on. Now." She finally looked at him, her golden eyes filled with something that looked like regret. "I warned you," she murmured. "You did not listen." Jack clenched his jaw. "Warn me about what?" Zerna hesitated. Then she asked softly, "How much do you know about your own species?" Jack frowned. "What kind of question is that?" Zerna exhaled slowly, composing herself. "Humans. You are an anomaly." Jack crossed his arms. "Yeah. In what way?" She licked her sharp teeth, as if struggling to find the right words. "Among all the species in the galaxy, only humans do not see their own presence completely." Jack's frown deepened. "What?" She looked away, as if embarrassed, then continued. "Every intelligent species has a way of perceiving itself. Even humans. Your eyes can see your body. Your hands can feel your skin. Your ears can hear your own voice. But there is something else. Jack felt his stomach tighten. Something else. Zherna nodded slowly. Something that you were never meant to see. Something that your species was designed to ignore. Jack shook his head. That makes no sense. Zherna's eyes darkened. It does to those who can see it. Jack's mouth felt dry. You mean, you? She nodded once. My kind sees things differently. We are not bound by human perception. And when I arrived here today, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it before I even saw it. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Saw what? Zherna closed her eyes for a long moment, then whispered, Your shadow does not belong to you. Jack felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He forced a nervous laugh. Okay, that's a new one. Zherna didn't laugh. She continued in a solemn tone. That is why you must always remain covered. Clothes, your garments, they act as a shield. They keep it dormant. The moment you expose too much, it starts to wake. Jack felt his breath come faster. That's ridiculous. I've been changing clothes my whole life, taking showers, sleeping without a shirt. Nothing's ever happened. Zherna didn't look convinced. Have you ever noticed strange marks on your walls? Jack opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. His stomach twisted. The scratches. They had appeared last night. Long, deep claw marks near his bedroom mirror. Jack had assumed he had just forgotten how they got there. That he must have scratched the wall in his sleep. But now, his skin turned cold. Zherna watched his reaction carefully. It doesn't move when you are fully covered, she said. But when your skin is bare, it becomes restless. Jack shook his head, trying to force logic into the conversation. That makes no sense. If what you're saying is true, then why hasn't anyone else figured this out? Why don't humans know about this? Zherna's gaze turned sharp. Because your species is blind to it. You are not meant to see, not meant to know. Jack clenched his fists. And what happens if I do see it? Zherna's tail twitched sharply. She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. Then it will see you back. A heavy silence filled the air. Jack exhaled shakily. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in superstitions, but something about Zherna's words felt too real to ignore. His gaze drifted toward his locked bedroom door. A quiet sound came from inside. A soft, dragging noise. Jack stiffened. The noise stopped the moment he noticed it. Zherna swallowed hard. Do not open that door. Jack looked at her, then back at the door. His throat felt dry. Something was inside. And for the first time in his life, Jack realized. Maybe he wasn't alone in his own skin. The hidden truth. Jack sat in his living room, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the locked bedroom door. The warning lights around the frame still glowed red, casting an eerie glow over the dark apartment. Zherna stood a few feet away, her golden eyes unblinking. Her tail flicked slightly, a nervous habit he was starting to notice. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. Then Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. This is insane, he muttered. Zherna didn't respond. Jack exhaled sharply and looked at her. You really expect me to believe there's some kind of thing in there? Something that only appears when I take my damn shirt off? Zherna tilted her head slightly, as if choosing her words carefully. Not something that appears, she said. Something that has always been there. Jack frowned. What? She took a step closer. It does not come from outside, Jack. It is not an invader, not a creature hiding under your bed. Jack's pulse quickened. Zherna's voice dropped to a near whisper. It is a part of you. Jack stiffened. That's ridiculous. Zherna's expression remained calm, but her claws twitched slightly, as if she was resisting the urge to grab him by the shoulders and shake the truth into him. You don't have to believe me, she said, but you have to listen. Jack clenched his jaw. He wasn't the kind of guy who scared easily. He had lived alone for years, never believed in ghosts or monsters. He had always thought aliens were weird, sure, but this was too much. He forced himself to relax, leaning back in his chair. All right. Explain. Start from the beginning. Zherna hesitated, then nodded. She moved to the opposite chair and sat down, folding her clawed hands together. What I am about to tell you, she said, is not something most humans will ever learn. Jack crossed his arms. I'm listening. Zherna took a deep breath, her golden eyes flickering. In my species, we do not only see what is there, we see what should not be. Jack frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does, she said. Humans, for all your intelligence, are incomplete. You think you see everything. You think you know your own form, your own body. But there is something inside you that your kind was never meant to notice. Jack swallowed. What do you mean, inside me? Zherna held his gaze. It is not a parasite. It is not a sickness. It is you. Or rather, the part of you that was meant to remain unseen. Jack felt his skin crawl. He shook his head. That's impossible. Zherna leaned forward. Have you ever caught your own reflection moving wrong? Have you ever turned off the lights and felt like something was still staring at you? Have you ever reached for something in the dark, and for just a second, thought that your hand felt wrong? Jack's fingers twitched. He thought about the times he had seen something strange in the corner of his eye. The times he had woken up in the middle of the night with a feeling of displacement, as if his body wasn't quite aligned with itself. But that was just imagination. Right. Jack shook his head. You're trying to tell me that humans have what? Some kind of hidden form. Zherna's tail flicked. Something like that. And you just broke the barrier. Jack clenched his fists. By taking my damn shirt off. Zherna's jaw tightened. By exposing too much, it does not react to small things. Your arms, your legs. But when too much is seen at once, when your form is exposed for too long, it stirs. Jack swallowed hard. He forced himself to laugh. This is crazy. This is. Scratch. Jack stopped. The sound came from the bedroom. A long, slow, deliberate scratch against the locked door. Zherna's breath hitched. Jack's body tensed, but he didn't move. He felt cold, his skin prickling with a sense of wrongness he couldn't explain. Then, in the silence, he heard it. Jack. His blood turned to ice. It came from inside the room. Jack's hands clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. That voice. It was his own. A perfect, exact replica of his own voice, whispering softly from behind a locked door. Jack couldn't breathe. Zherna stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. We have to leave, she hissed. Jack's mind raced. That is not you. The whisper came again, this time closer to the door. Jack, come inside. Jack's throat went dry. The doorknob twitched. A quiet, slow rattle. Jack's heart pounded so hard it hurt. Zherna grabbed his wrist and yanked him toward the exit. We leave. Now. Jack didn't argue. They moved fast, heading toward the apartment door. Jack's fingers flew across the security panel, unlocking it in seconds. Just as the door slid open, a sound came from behind them. A loud, sickening creak. Jack turned his head just in time to see the bedroom door slowly start to open. A single hand reached through the gap. A human hand. Jack's breath caught. It was his. Same fingers, same knuckles, same tiny scar near the thumb where he had cut himself as a kid. But the fingers moved wrong. Too smooth, too slow. Jack's mind screamed at him to run, but he couldn't look away. Then, the hand twitched. The fingers curled in a slow, deliberate motion. And then, with a voice that was almost his own, it whispered, You left the door open, Jack. Jack didn't think. He bolted. He and Zherna rushed out into the corridor, slamming the door shut behind them. Zherna immediately pressed a sequence on her wrist device. A second later, a high-pitched alarm blared through the hallway. Jack barely had time to process what was happening before the emergency lockdown doors slammed shut over his apartment. A thick steel barrier, sealing whatever was inside. Jack panted, heart racing. His skin felt too tight, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. Zherna stood beside him, tense, shaking slightly. She looked up at him and said, "Now do you believe me?" Jack stared at the massive metal door, feeling his own breath ragged in his chest. From inside his apartment, muffled behind the thick steel, he heard it. A slow, deliberate knock. And then softly, "You forgot something, Jack." Jack didn't answer. He just ran. The silent stalker. Jack didn't stop running until he was 4 floors down, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. The stark white hallways of his apartment complex felt too open, too empty, like something unseen was watching him from every corner. Zherna moved beside him, her claws flexing, tail swaying in tight, controlled movements. She wasn't out of breath. Her species was built for endurance, but she was tense, very tense. Jack forced himself to stop, pressing a hand against the cold metal wall. His whole body was shaking. He had always thought of himself as rational, the kind of guy who didn't fall for ghost stories or conspiracies. But this was something else. Something had been inside his apartment, something wearing his shape, something that knew his voice, and it was still in there. He turned toward Zherna, who was scanning their surroundings, checking for unseen threats. Jack wiped a hand down his face. "Okay," he rasped, voice raw. "I need you to start talking. Right now. No riddles, no cryptic bullshit. What is happening to me?" Zherna hesitated. For a second, she looked almost guilty. Then, in a soft, deliberate voice, she said, "It woke up." Jack's stomach twisted. "What?" Zherna turned to face him fully. Her golden eyes weren't just serious. They were filled with something deeper, something that almost looked like pity. "Whatever it is," she said carefully, "it has always been there, Jack. Sleeping, silent, dormant." Jack clenched his jaw. "And now?" She exhaled. "Now it knows you can see it." Jack's fingers curled into fists. That thing in his apartment, the voice, the hand, it hadn't just imitated him. It was him. Or at least, it was something that thought it was him. Jack felt his pulse hammering in his skull. "How do I stop this?" Zherna didn't answer immediately. She just watched him, her claws tapping softly against the wall. Finally, she said, "You can't." Jack froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway lights buzzed softly overhead, the only sound in the empty corridor. Jack swallowed. "What do you mean, I can't?" Zherna's gaze didn't waver. "It's not something you can fight. It's not something you can kill. It's not even something that should exist outside your perception." Jack felt something cold spread through his chest. "So what the hell am I supposed to do?" Zherna licked her sharp teeth, then said, "You run." Jack clenched his jaw. "That's it. That's your brilliant plan. Run?" Zherna stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't understand, Jack. This thing, it is a part of you. It's not a separate entity, not an intruder. It is the version of you that was never meant to be seen." Jack's skin prickled. "That's insane." Zherna's expression didn't change. "Is it?" Jack took a shaky breath, shaking his head. Okay, let's say I believe you. Why now? I've been walking around shirtless for years. I've taken showers, changed clothes." Zherna's tail flicked sharply. "Because you never looked." Jack stopped. Zherna leaned in slightly, golden eyes burning into his. "You exposed yourself just enough to awaken its presence, but what truly triggered it was when you noticed. When you felt something was wrong, when your mind opened just enough to recognize that something else was there." Jack's breath hitched. He thought about the scratches on his walls, the feeling of being watched, the moment he saw his own hand reaching through the doorway. "I didn't do anything," he whispered. "I didn't call it. I didn't summon it." Zherna's tail flicked again. "You don't have to summon your own shadow. It's always been waiting." Jack swallowed, his mouth dry. A chill crawled down his spine. "What does it want?" Zherna hesitated. Then she said, "To take your place." Jack's chest tightened. His stomach churned with something dark and primal, like an ancient warning buried deep in his instincts. He whispered, "You're telling me that thing wants to replace me." Zherna's expression darkened. "Not replace." "Correct." Jack's pulse pounded. "Correct. What the hell does that mean?" Zherna exhaled through her sharp teeth. "I told you before, Jack. You are incomplete. Every human is. Your species only perceives a fraction of what you truly are." Jack's throat tightened. "So what? This thing is the missing piece." Zherna nodded. Jack felt his blood run cold. His mind raced through everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. The strange scratches on his walls, the breathing in his room, the way his own reflection had felt. Off. And then the hand that was identical to his own. Jack forced himself to take a deep breath. "All right. If I can't stop it, if I can't fight it, what do I do?" Zherna's golden eyes locked onto his. "You have to get away from it." Jack frowned. "How far?" Zherna hesitated, then said softly, "Not just from your apartment. From yourself." Jack stared at her. The hallway light flickered once. Then he heard it. A faint, muffled knock. Jack's blood turned to ice. The sound came from above. Slowly, stiffly, he tilted his head up toward the ceiling. His breath caught. There was a handprint on the metal surface. A perfect, human handprint. And as Jack stared, it began to move, dragging across the ceiling, following him. His stomach dropped. Zherna grabbed his wrist. "Jack," she said, voice sharp, "we need to move. Now." Jack tore his eyes away from the moving handprint. His pulse hammered in his ears as he followed Zherna into the dark. The entity. Jack sprinted down the empty corridor, his breath ragged, his heartbeat a frantic drum in his chest. Zherna ran beside him, her golden eyes flicking toward the ceiling every few seconds. Jack didn't dare look up. He didn't want to see if the handprints were still following him. They reached the end of the hallway, where a reinforced security door led to the stairwell. Zherna slammed her fist against the panel, but the door didn't budge. The emergency lockdown was still active. Jack swallowed hard. "Can you override it?" Zherna's tail flicked sharply. "I am not an engineer, Jack." Jack cursed under his breath. His apartment was on lockdown. His floor was locked down. If they didn't find a way out, they'd be trapped here with it. Jack clenched his fists. "We can't stay here." Zherna turned, her sharp claws flexing. "Then we find another way." Before Jack could respond, tap. A soft, deliberate sound. Not from behind them. Not from the side. From above. Jack's throat went dry. He finally looked up. His stomach dropped. The ceiling was wrong. The overhead panels had become warped, twisted, like something on the other side was pressing against them, pushing the metal outward. And in the center of the distortion, a handprint pressed against the surface. Then another. And another. They weren't just handprints anymore. They were moving, sliding, crawling. A slow, deliberate dragging sound filled the hallway. Jack felt his pulse pound in his throat. Then, the ceiling buckled. A crack split open above them. For a split second, Jack saw something move. A glimpse of pale skin. A sliver of a face, his own. Then the crack snapped shut. Jack staggered back. His mind screamed at him to run. Zherna grabbed his arm. "Jack, move." A split second later, the lights went out. The hallway plunged into darkness. The voice in the dark. Jack's breath hitched. He felt Jurna's claws tighten around his wrist. Silence. Then, Jack. A whisper. Right behind him. Jack's spine went rigid. The voice was his. Not an echo. Not a recording. It was him. The darkness around him felt thicker, heavier. His skin prickled, like something unseen was pressing against him. Jack didn't move. He didn't breathe. He could feel it. Something standing behind him. Close. So close he could feel its breath on the back of his neck. Then, a slow, wet clicking noise, like someone trying to speak with a mouth that wasn't supposed to move. Jack clenched his fists. Don't turn around. Don't look. Jurna squeezed his wrist. Her voice was a razor-thin whisper. It is testing you. Jack swallowed hard. Jurna continued, her tone deadly serious. Do not respond. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. He forced himself to stare straight ahead. Then, cold fingers brushed against the back of his neck. Jack jerked forward, spinning around before he could stop himself. His breath caught. There was nothing there. But the air where he had been standing felt wrong, like something had just moved away from him. Then, the lights flickered back on. Jack blinked, chest rising and falling fast. He turned to Jurna. What the hell was that? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly turned her gaze toward the floor. Jack followed her eyes, and his stomach dropped. Footprints. Bare, human footprints. Leading away from where he had just stood. Jack's entire body went cold, because he was still wearing his shoes. The warning. Jurna grabbed his wrist. We are leaving. Now. Jack didn't argue. They moved fast, heading toward the maintenance access hatch at the end of the corridor. Jurna forced it open with a sharp tug, revealing a tight ventilation shaft. Jack stared at the small dark passage. You've got to be kidding me. Jurna didn't wait for him to protest. She climbed in first, her tail disappearing into the cramped metal tunnel. Jack hesitated. Then, a sound echoed from the hallway behind him. A slow, deliberate knocking. Jack's breath hitched. Then the voice came again. Jack. Too close. Jack turned and hurled himself into the vent. The reflection. They crawled through the narrow passage, the metal cold against Jack's palms. The space was tight, barely large enough for him to move. Jurna moved ahead, her breathing steady. We need to find a way out of the building. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead. How do we stop it? Jurna didn't respond right away. Then she whispered, You don't. Jack clenched his jaw. That's not an answer. Jurna exhaled. There is only one thing you can do. Jack's heart pounded. What? Jurna's golden eyes flicked toward him. You must never let it see you fully. Jack frowned. What does that mean? Jurna's tail flicked. That thing, it wants to take your place. But it can only do that if it fully understands what you are, if you let it study you long enough, if it sees you from every angle, if it pieces you together. She hesitated. Jack's mouth went dry. Then what? Jurna whispered. Then you stop being Jack. Jack felt his pulse hammering in his skull. Then, the metal shaft shook violently. Something slammed into it from behind. Jurna froze. Jack's breath caught. Slowly, he turned his head, and his stomach dropped, because behind him, pressed against the metal wall of the vent, was a reflection. But there was no glass, no mirror, just him, looking back at himself, smiling. Jack didn't have time to scream. The reflection lunged. The last warning. Jack jerked backward, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection, his reflection, lunged toward him. There was no glass between them, no mirror, just the metal wall of the vent. And yet, somehow, his own face was there, grinning, watching, moving when he didn't. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The vent was too tight, too cramped. Zherna was ahead, already twisting around to see what was happening. The reflection's eyes locked onto Jack's. And then it spoke. "Let me in." Jack's stomach turned. The voice was his, but wrong. Too smooth, too perfect. The lips moved in sync with the words, but something about them was off, like they were trying to mimic human speech, trying to understand it. The moment stretched. Jack felt his body going rigid, his breathing slow. A part of him wanted to answer, to respond, to acknowledge it. Don't. Zherna's warning rang in his mind. Do not speak to it. Do not acknowledge it. Jack clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. The reflection's grin widened. "Jack," it whispered. The sound was softer now, coaxing. "Let me in. We'll be whole again." Jack's skin crawled. He jerked his gaze away, heart hammering, forcing himself to look anywhere else. But then, a hand pushed through the metal. Jack's mind nearly snapped. The metal didn't break. It didn't bend or warp. The hand, his own hand, just slid through, like the barrier wasn't even there. Like it wasn't real. Jack gasped, shoving himself backward. The vent was too narrow. His shoulders scraped against the walls, but he didn't care. Zherna moved fast. She twisted, claws flashing, and slashed at the hand. The thing jerked back. Then it laughed. A cold, empty sound. Jack's body went ice cold. Zherna didn't wait. She grabbed his wrist and yanked. "Move." Jack didn't argue. He scrambled forward as fast as he could. The vent rattled around them as they crawled, twisting left, then right, then left again. But behind them, the laughter followed. And then, from the darkness, a whisper. "You can't run from yourself." The escape. They burst out of the vent seconds later, tumbling onto the hard floor of a dimly lit maintenance bay. Jack barely caught himself, his arms shaking. His breath came fast and shallow. Zherna was already moving. She slapped her wrist console, accessing the security override. Jack groaned, pushing himself up. His mind was racing, heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't stop shaking. "What the hell was that?" he rasped. Zherna didn't look at him. "We need to keep moving." Jack swallowed hard. "No, no more running. You need to tell me exactly what's happening." Zherna hesitated. Then she exhaled, shoulders tense. "It's learning," she said. Jack's breath hitched. "What?" Zherna turned, eyes serious. "It is becoming more complete. The longer it studies you, the longer it mimics you, the more real it becomes." Jack's mind spun. "But it's not real." Zherna's jaw clenched. "Not yet." Jack's skin prickled. "Not yet." Zherna exhaled slowly. "Jack, what do you think happens when it finishes learning?" Jack's throat tightened. For the first time, true fear settled deep in his bones. Because he knew the answer. "It takes my place." Zherna nodded, as if reading his thoughts. "That is why we need to leave." Jack ran a shaking hand through his hair. "Leave." Zherna's tail flicked sharply. "We have one option, Jack. We get off-world." Jack frowned. "Off-world? You're saying this thing can't follow me if I leave the planet?" Zherna's eyes darkened. "Not if it hasn't finished." Jack exhaled. Okay, fine. Let's go. Right now." Zherna turned, tapping her wrist console again. "There's an emergency transport pad 2 floors down. If we can reach it, we..." Tap. They both froze. Jack's stomach dropped. The sound came from behind them. Slowly, he turned, and his blood went cold. There, standing at the far end of the bay, was himself. Jack stopped breathing. The figure stood perfectly still. Its skin was identical to his. Its posture was identical to his. But the eyes The eyes were wrong. Too wide. Too aware. And then, it smiled. Jack's pulse pounded. He stepped back instinctively. The thing tilted its head. Then, in a voice perfectly identical to his own, it said, "You don't need to leave, Jack." Jack's throat went dry. His double took a slow step forward. "You just need to let me in." Zherna moved fast. She grabbed Jack's arm and whispered, "Run." But Jack couldn't move, because in that moment, his double blinked, and when its eyes opened again, Jack realized it wasn't imitating him anymore. It was looking at him like an intruder, like he was the one who didn't belong. Jack's pulse thundered. Then, the double whispered, "You left the door open too long, Jack." And it lunged. The final revelation. Jack barely had time to react. His double lunged. Zherna yanked him backward, and they hit the ground hard, rolling as the thing slammed into the spot where Jack had just been standing. Jack scrambled up, his pulse hammering in his ears. He finally saw it up close. His own face, his own skin, his own movements. But wrong. Too fluid. Too perfect. And the eyes, they weren't just copying anymore. They were aware. Jack's breath caught. It wasn't learning anymore. It was ready. The thing tilted its head, smiling. "There's no need to run," it whispered, voice calm. Jack's voice. Jack staggered back. "What the hell are you?" The double stepped closer. "On you." Jack shook his head. "No, you're not." The thing's grin widened. "I'm the part of you that was never meant to be seen." Jack's stomach twisted. "That's impossible." The double took another step forward. "You feel it, don't you?" it whispered. "The wrongness. The emptiness. The way your body feels disjointed, like a puzzle with missing pieces." Jack's hands trembled. The double chuckled. "You always thought you were whole." It shook its head. "But you weren't. You were just unfinished." Jack's breath hitched. He took a step back, but his double stepped forward. "Let me in, Jack." The voice was soft now, almost gentle. "I can fix us." Jack felt his mind spiraling. His skin felt too tight, like it wasn't his own. He clenched his jaw. "I don't need to be fixed." The double blinked. "You don't understand." Its smile faded. "I'm not here to replace you." Jack's breath caught. The double took one final step. "I'm here to bring you back." Jack's pulse froze. The words didn't make sense. "Bring me back." Then, a hand grabbed his wrist. Jack's entire body locked up. It felt cold. Wrong. The moment stretched. His mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to run. But then, for just a second, the world changed. The other side. Jack wasn't in the maintenance bay anymore. He was somewhere else. A space without walls, without time. Just infinite black. A mirror stood before him. Massive. Endless. Reflecting nothing. And then, from the darkness, he stepped forward. Him. Jack. But not. The other him, the asterisk double. Asterisk stood in front of the mirror, staring at him. Jack's breath shook. He wasn't in his body anymore. He was outside himself. He looked at himself from the wrong angle. His mind reeled. His chest tightened. The double stepped closer to the mirror, and this time, Jack saw it. The truth. The thing in the mirror, the thing he had always been, wasn't real. Jack wasn't supposed to exist. He was the reflection. The double's voice whispered, "Come back, Jack." Jack staggered. His mind buckled. This wasn't a copy. This wasn't an imposter. He was the imposter. Jack's pulse thundered. The truth crashed into him like a tidal wave. He had always felt off, disconnected, like his body wasn't quite his own. Because it wasn't. He had spent his whole life as the echo of something else. A shadow, A mistake. A reflection that walked away. The thing in the mirror smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Jack." Jack screamed. And then, the world snapped back. The final choice. Jack collapsed onto the cold floor. The maintenance bay swam into focus. His body was drenched in sweat, his head spinning. Zherna was beside him, shaking him. "Jack, Jack, wake up." Jack gasped, sitting up fast. His chest heaved. He was still here, still in his body. But his double was watching him. Silent, still, but no longer smiling. It understood now. And so did Jack. Jack staggered to his feet, eyes locking onto it. "I'm not going back," Jack whispered. The double tilted its head. Jack clenched his fists. "You might be the real one. Maybe I'm not supposed to exist. But I do." The double's expression was unreadable. "You don't belong here, Jack," it said softly. Jack's heart pounded. "Then I'll make my own place." The double didn't move. Then it smiled and stepped backward. The world seemed to bend around it. Its form flickered, distorted. Then it was gone. Just like that. Jack staggered. His vision swam. He felt like his body wasn't fully anchored, like he could disappear at any second. Then Zherna grabbed his shoulder, and everything snapped back into place. Jack gasped, lungs filling with air. His head cleared. Zherna's eyes were dead serious. "We need to get you off-world. Now." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't argue. They turned and ran. Epilogue. A new shadow. Hours later, Jack sat on the edge of a spaceship seat, staring out the window as the Earth became smaller and smaller. He had made it. He had left. But as he stared at the reflection in the glass, he hesitated. For a split second, his own reflection didn't move. Just for a second. Then it smiled. And Jack looked away. The end.